They said the strongest hearts were the hardest to reach. But sometimes, all it took was one moment when death arrived before pride had a chance to speak. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe the greatest victories are won with compassion instead of bullets, like this story and follow along. Now, let's ride back to a forgotten corner of the American frontier. Long before people remembered her name with admiration, they spoke it with a mixture of respect and quiet surrender. Aiyana Nantan was unlike any woman the Apache had ever known. Hunters admired her courage. Elders trusted her judgment. Young warriors dreamed of earning her respect, only to walk away with lowered eyes. She had turned away every man who had ever asked to share her future. Some believed she was too proud. Others whispered that she had given her heart to the mountains themselves. Aiyana never answered either rumor. She simply smiled, saddled her horse before sunrise, and disappeared into the endless red mesas where hawks circled above ancient cliffs and the desert wind carried secrets older than memory. The land knew her footsteps better than most people did. Every canyon, every dry riverbed, every lonely cottonwood tree seemed to recognize the quiet woman riding beneath the vast western sky. She preferred silence over conversation, action over promises, and truth over charm. No man had ever changed that. Then came the morning everything began to unravel. The first sign was not danger. It was beauty. Golden light spilled across the desert like liquid fire, painting every rock with shades of copper and amber. Aiyana guided her horse through a narrow pass while tracking a wounded antelope. The air smelled of sagebrush and warm stone. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk cried once before disappearing into the rising sun. Then the horse froze. Its ears snapped forward. Aiyana's fingers tightened around the reins. The silence had changed. Experienced hunters knew there were different kinds of quiet. One belonged to peace. The other belonged to something waiting. She slowly reached for the bough resting against her. Saddle. Before she could draw it, frightened hoofbeats exploded from the opposite side of the canyon. A terrified Mustang burst through the dust, followed by tumbling rocks crashing down the steep hillside. The antelope vanished. The horse beneath Aiyana reared violently. She fought for balance, but loose stones rolled beneath the animal's hooves. For one suspended heartbeat, horse and rider hung between the trail and the empty canyon below. Then the earth gave way. Dust swallowed everything. The frightened horse stumbled free, but Aiyana was thrown against jagged rock before sliding down the steep slope, disappearing beneath clouds of red sand and shattered stone. The canyon became silent once more. Far above, the wind continued its endless journey as though nothing had happened. Miles away, another rider lifted his head. Caleb Walker had been driving stray cattle toward the northern range when he noticed a flock of ravens suddenly rising from the canyon ahead. Ranchers learned long ago that birds often reached a tragedy before people did. He narrowed his gray eyes toward the distant cliffs. Without knowing why, he turned his horse away from the herd and rode straight toward the silence waiting beyond the dust. Caleb Walker had learned long ago that the frontier rarely announced disaster with shouting. It whispered first. A circle of ravens, a frightened horse, a silence that did not belong to the desert. He urged his bay gelding through the narrow canyon, boots brushing against sagebrush while loose gravel rolled beneath the animal's hooves. The morning sun had barely climbed above the cliffs, yet the air already carried the dry warmth of another unforgiving day. Every instinct told him someone needed help. He simply did not know who. Then he saw the horse, saddled, riderless. Its reins dragged across the stones as it stood trembling beside a broken trail. Caleb dismounted without hesitation. Kneeling beside the scattered tracks, he noticed fresh blood darkening the reddish dust. His jaw tightened. The trail disappeared over the edge of a steep embankment. He climbed down carefully, gripping roots and jagged rocks while pebbles tumbled into the ravine below. Halfway down, he found the bough first. Beautifully crafted. Apache workmanship. A few feet farther rested a quiver with only 2 arrows remaining. Caleb understood enough about the frontier to recognize what that meant. Whoever carried this had fought before falling. When he reached the canyon floor, he finally saw her. Aiyana lay partly hidden beneath broken branches and windblown sand. A deep bruise colored one side of her face, while blood seeped through a tear along her shoulder. One ankle rested at an unnatural angle. Yet even unconscious, one hand still gripped a small hunting knife so tightly her knuckles had turned pale beneath bronze skin. Caleb stopped for a brief moment. Most men in the territory would have backed away. Some feared Apache warriors. Others feared what people in town might think if they were found helping one. Caleb looked only at the woman struggling to breathe. Nothing else mattered. He removed his hat and gently knelt beside her. "Easy now," he murmured, though she could not hear him. He poured a little water onto a clean cloth and carefully wiped the dust from the cut above her brow. The desert had stolen too much blood already. It would not take the rest if he could stop it. Using strips torn from his own shirt, he wrapped her shoulder tightly before finding 2 straight branches to support her injured ankle. His movements were slow, patient, practiced. Ranch work had taught him how quickly small injuries became fatal when help lay miles away. As he reached beneath her to lift her onto a blanket spread across the ground, Aiyana's eyes flew open. In one swift motion, the knife flashed upward until its worn blade rested against Caleb's throat. Her breathing was ragged, but her stare burned with fierce defiance. For several endless seconds, neither of them moved. Wind drifted softly through the canyon, carrying grains of sand between them. Caleb never reached for his revolver. Instead, he slowly raised both empty hands where she could see them. "If you still have enough strength to threaten me," he said quietly, "then I reckon you're going to live." Confusion flickered behind her hardened eyes. She tried to push herself upright, but pain surged through her injured leg. The knife slipped from trembling fingers and clattered against the rocks. Darkness claimed her once again before a single word could pass her lips. Caleb caught her before she struck the ground. Looking toward the endless canyon walls, he realized the hardest part of the journey had not been finding her. It would be convincing her that not every white man arrived carrying harm. By the time Caleb reached his ranch, the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the prairie into shades of gold and pale brown. His cabin stood alone beside a narrow creek, sheltered by a handful of cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered softly whenever the wind wandered through them. It was not much to look at: weathered timber, a sagging porch, and a barn that had seen better years, but it had always been enough for one man. Now it held 2. Caleb carried Aiyana inside as carefully as though she were made of glass. She never woke. Fever had begun to settle across her face, leaving a faint sheen on her skin despite the cool cloth resting against her forehead. He laid her on his own bed, then stepped back. The hunting knife still rested beside her hand. He had picked it up from the canyon instead of throwing it away. Somehow, he suspected she would look for it before she looked at him. Outside, his horse snorted impatiently while cattle drifted lazily beyond the fence. Life continued exactly as it always had. Only the little cabin felt different. Caleb heated water over the iron stove, crushed dried yarrow and willow bark with the back of a spoon, and cleaned the cuts along her shoulder once more. Every movement was quiet, respectful. He never touched more than necessity demanded. As evening settled over the prairie, Aiyana finally opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was a wooden ceiling. The second was a white man sitting several feet away, repairing a saddle beneath the fading light of an oil lamp. Instinct took over before thought. She reached for her knife. Her hand found only empty blanket. In the same heartbeat, Caleb looked up. "It's beside the bed," he said calmly without rising. "I figured you'd want it close." Her eyes shifted. The knife rested exactly where he had said. Not hidden, not out of reach. She picked it up immediately, ignoring the pain shooting through her shoulder. "Where am I?" Her voice was rough from thirst. "My ranch." "Why?" Caleb tied another stitch into the leather before answering. "Because the canyon would have buried you before sunset." She stared at him, searching for mockery that never came. "What do you want?" Caleb finally met her eyes. "Nothing." That answer unsettled her more than any lie could have. She had spent her entire life believing every favor demanded payment. Every kindness carried a price hidden beneath polite words. Yet this stranger had given her his bed, his medicine, and his water while asking for nothing except that she stay alive. She hated not understanding it. Silence settled between them. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere outside, coyotes began calling across the open grasslands as darkness spread over the frontier. Aiyana slowly tried to sit upright. Pain tore through her injured ankle, forcing a sharp breath through clenched teeth. Before she could fall, Caleb instinctively stepped forward. She lifted the knife. Don't. He stopped immediately. Not another inch. He simply nodded once and stepped back again. Fair enough. The distance between them returned. After a long moment, he slid a tin cup across the wooden floor instead of handing it to her. Water. She hesitated before taking it. Even then, she never lowered the knife. Caleb returned to repairing the saddle as though nothing unusual had happened. The quiet confused her. Most men filled silence with questions. He seemed perfectly comfortable letting it remain. Long after darkness swallowed the last light outside the cabin window, Aiyana watched him from beneath half-closed eyes. He worked until the saddle was finished, covered the fire so the room would stay warm through the night, then carried a blanket onto the porch instead of sleeping inside. The cabin belonged to her until she could walk again. Listening to the slow rhythm of his footsteps fading across the wooden boards, Aiyana whispered something she had never expected to think about any white man. Perhaps he truly expected nothing in return. Morning arrived wrapped in pale mist drifting above the creek. Dew clung to the tall grass, and the cottonwood leaves shimmered softly whenever the breeze passed through them. Caleb was already outside repairing a section of broken fence before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley. The steady rhythm of his hammer echoed across the quiet ranch. Inside the cabin, Aiyana sat awake on the edge of the bed. Her ankles still throbbed, but the fever had begun to fade. She tested her weight carefully. Pain answered immediately, forcing her to grip the bedpost until the room stopped spinning. Through the window, she watched Caleb working alone. No guards, no ropes, no locked door. If he had wished to keep her prisoner, he had chosen the strangest way imaginable. She quietly reached for her knife, tucked it beneath her belt, and stepped outside. Caleb noticed her only when the screen door creaked behind him. He looked up, then returned to his work without surprise. Morning. She said nothing. Her eyes wandered across the ranch instead. Horses grazed peacefully beyond the corral. Chickens scratched beside the barn. Smoke curled lazily from the cabin chimney. It looked less like the home of a dangerous enemy than the life of a man who spent more time fixing broken things than breaking them. You should still be resting, Caleb said after a while. I decide when I rest. He nodded once. Figured you might say that. Again, silence settled between them. Aiyana hated how comfortable he seemed inside it. She had expected questions, curiosity, perhaps demands. Instead, he simply kept replacing weathered fence posts one after another, as though her presence required no explanation. Near midday, distant shouting drifted across the prairie. Caleb stopped working immediately. 3 frightened horses raced toward the ranch with no riders in their saddles. Close behind them came a small wagon bouncing wildly over uneven ground. 2 children clung desperately to the front seat, while the frightened mule pulling the wagon fought against tangled harness straps. One broken wheel struck a rock, throwing the wagon violently sideways. Stay here, Caleb called. He was already running before the sentence ended. Aiyana instinctively followed despite the pain in her ankle. The runaway wagon thundered toward a dry creek bed where a single collision could send the children tumbling beneath splintered wood. Caleb reached the mule first. Without hesitation, he grabbed the dragging reins with both hands. The frightened animal jerked violently, nearly pulling him off his feet. Dust exploded around them. Leather burned against his palms as he fought to slow the panicked beast. Finally, the mule stumbled to a stop only a few yards from the rocky embankment. The children burst into tears. Caleb knelt beside them immediately. You're all right, he said gently. Nobody's hurt. He checked them carefully before lifting the younger child from the wagon. The little girl wrapped both arms around his neck without thinking. Only then did 2 frantic parents come racing over the hill on horseback. Relief flooded their faces. They thanked Caleb over and over before leading the children home. No reward changed hands. No long speeches followed. As the dust slowly settled, Aiyana remained standing beneath the cottonwood tree, watching the scene unfold. Caleb wiped blood from his scraped hands onto his jeans, as though the injuries barely mattered. He never looked toward the departing family to see whether they appreciated what he had done. He simply walked back to the unfinished fence and picked up his hammer once more. For the first time since waking inside his cabin, Aiyana found herself questioning something far more difficult than his intentions. She was beginning to question everything she believed she already knew about the man himself. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Sunrise found Caleb feeding horses before the dew disappeared from the prairie. Aiyana, though still limping, insisted on walking farther each morning. She refused help whenever he offered it, and before long, he stopped offering. Somehow, that earned more of her respect than persistence ever could. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. The wind filled the empty spaces between their words. The creek murmured beside the ranch. Leather creaked beneath Caleb's hands as he repaired saddles beneath the barn roof, while Aiyana sharpened arrows sitting in the shade of an old cottonwood. They lived side by side like strangers who had quietly agreed not to become enemies. One afternoon, clouds gathered over the western hills, bringing a welcome breeze across the dry valley. Caleb saddled his horse. "I'm heading into Iron Ridge for supplies," he said. "You'll need fresh bandages." Aiyana looked up immediately. "I need nothing from your town." Caleb shrugged. "Suit yourself." He rode away before she could answer. Curiosity proved stronger than pride. An hour later, Aiyana followed on horseback, staying well behind him among the rolling hills where sagebrush stretched toward the horizon. By late afternoon, Iron Ridge appeared beneath the fading sunlight. Wagons crowded the dusty main street. Laughter spilled from the saloon. Children chased one another past the general store, while ranchers tied their horses outside the blacksmith shop. Aiyana remained hidden behind a stand of cottonwoods overlooking the town. She had no intention of entering. She only wanted to see how Caleb lived among his own people. What she witnessed surprised her. Several men standing outside the mercantile fell silent as Caleb approached. One older rancher spat into the dust. "Walker," he muttered. "Didn't think you'd show your face after what happened last spring." Another laughed. "Still wasting your time helping folks who'll never pay you back?" Caleb answered with nothing more than a polite nod. He walked inside the store without defending himself. The laughter followed him through the open doorway. Aiyana frowned. She had expected admiration. Instead, she found quiet contempt. Moments later, an elderly widow stepped out of the store carrying 2 heavy flour sacks. One slipped from her hands, scattering groceries across the dusty street. The same men who had mocked Caleb simply watched. Caleb emerged carrying his own supplies. Without hesitation, he knelt beside the woman, gathering every apple and tin can from the dirt before lifting both sacks onto her wagon. The widow smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Caleb. Safe travels." "Mrs. Harper." He tipped his hat and walked away before she could say another word. The ranchers laughed again. "That's all he'll ever get," one called after him. "A thank you." Caleb never looked back. Hidden beyond the trees, Aiyana felt something shift inside her. Among her own people, honor brought respect. Here, this man did honorable things and received ridicule instead. Yet nothing about his expression suggested disappointment. He behaved as though kindness did not require an audience. As the sun slipped lower behind the mountains, Caleb guided his horse toward the trail home. Aiyana remained concealed until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Only then did she whisper softly into the evening wind, almost surprised by the words herself. "Who are you really?" The prairie offered no answer. It simply carried her question westward, where the coming sunset promised that the greatest truths were still waiting beyond the next horizon. The ride back to the ranch unfolded beneath a sky streaked with crimson and gold. Neither Caleb nor Aiyana spoke. The silence between them no longer felt sharp. It had become something quieter, something neither of them was ready to name. The steady rhythm of 2 horses crossing the prairie seemed enough conversation for one evening. As darkness settled across the valley, coyotes called from distant ridges while the first stars appeared above the endless western sky. Caleb unsaddled his horse, filled the water trough, and checked the barn doors as he always did. Routine had become his way of keeping the world simple. Inside the cabin, Aiyana watched the small rituals through the window. Every movement carried the calm confidence of a man who expected nothing from anyone except an honest day's work. It unsettled her more than open hostility ever had. Before dawn the following morning, a sharp echo rolled across the hills. Then another. Rifle shots. Caleb looked toward the northern ridge before setting down his coffee cup. The sound was too distant for a hunting party and too scattered for a battle. Something else was happening. Aiyana stepped outside almost instantly. She had heard it too. They exchanged a single glance before, mounting their horses without another word. The trail climbed through rocky hills until smoke appeared between the juniper trees. When they reached the ridge, both riders stopped. Below them, a small Apache camp stood in confusion. Several frightened horses had broken free after a lightning-struck tree crashed into the edge of the encampment during the night storm. Children scattered as panicked animals raced between the lodges. One frightened colt bolted toward the narrow ravine where two young Apache boys stood frozen with fear. Aiyana's heart tightened. She kicked her horse forward without hesitation. Caleb followed just as quickly. The colt thundered toward the children, eyes wild with panic. Aiyana reached them first, shouting in Apache as she pulled one frightened boy away from the trail. The second child stumbled over a fallen branch and collapsed directly in the horse's path. There was no time. Caleb threw himself from his saddle before the animal reached the boy. He caught the child, rolled across the rocky ground, and shielded him beneath his own body as the colt leaped past only inches away. Dust filled the air. Silence followed. Slowly Caleb pushed himself upright, wincing as blood trickled from a scrape along his forehead. The little boy stared at him with wide eyes before bursting into tears. His mother came running. She pulled the child into her arms, then looked at the white cowboy standing quietly a few steps away. Suspicion flickered across several Apache faces gathering nearby. Hands rested cautiously on bows and knives. Caleb noticed every one of them. Without speaking, he simply retrieved his hat from the dirt, placed it back on his head, and walked toward his waiting horse. He had not come seeking gratitude. He had come because children were in danger. That was enough. Aiyana watched him in silence. For the first time since meeting Caleb Walker, she saw him standing among her own people instead of his. He did not ask to be trusted. He did not defend himself. He simply chose kindness again, even when surrounded by those who had every reason to doubt him. As the morning wind carried the scent of wet earth through the camp, one of the tribal elders stepped forward and looked from Aiyana to Caleb. His weathered face revealed nothing, yet his quiet eyes suggested that something far greater than a single rescue had just begun. The old Apache elder did not speak immediately. He simply studied Caleb Walker the way a man studies distant mountains before deciding whether they would shelter him from a storm or bury him beneath one. Around them, frightened horses had finally settled. Mothers gathered their children close. Warriors lowered their bows, though no one returned a weapon completely to its place. Trust was never built in a single morning. It arrived one quiet choice at a time. Caleb adjusted the saddle on his horse and tipped his hat politely. "Looks like everyone's safe," he said. "That's all that matters." He turned to leave. "Wait." The single word came from Aiyana. Caleb stopped, but did not face her immediately. She walked toward him, favoring the ankle that had not yet fully healed. The entire camp watched in complete silence. "You saved that boy," she said. "Anyone would have." She shook her head. "No." Her voice remained calm, but something inside it had changed. "Not everyone." Before Caleb could answer, another rider appeared at the edge of the camp, urging his exhausted horse forward. Dust covered both man and animal. The messenger spoke quickly to the elder in Apache. The elder's expression hardened. Several warriors immediately exchanged uneasy glances. Aiyana listened carefully, then looked toward the western hills. "What happened?" Caleb asked quietly. She hesitated for only a moment. "A group of land speculators arrived near the southern valley this morning. They've begun driving stakes into Apache grazing land." Caleb frowned. "Do they know people live there?" "They know." Her answer came like stone. "They simply do not care." The elder addressed the gathered warriors. Several wanted to ride immediately. Others argued for patience. Voices grew louder with every passing moment until anger replaced reason. Caleb remained outside the circle. This was not his place. Yet he recognized something painfully familiar. Pride was beginning to speak louder than wisdom. Finally, the elders' eyes settled on Caleb once again. "White Rancher," he said in slow English. "What would your people do?" Every face turned toward him. Caleb took a long breath before answering. "Depends which people you mean." A few puzzled expressions appeared. "If you mean honest ranchers," he continued, "they'd ask to see who truly owns the land." His gaze shifted toward the distant valley. "If you mean greedy men looking for profit," he paused. "They don't listen until someone richer or braver stands in front of them." The elder remained silent. Caleb continued, "Riding and angry won't change their minds. It'll only give them the excuse they're hoping for." One of the younger Apache warriors stepped forward, frustration burning in his eyes. "So we do nothing?" Caleb met the young man's stare without challenge. No, he answered quietly. You do the harder thing first. The words drifted through the camp with surprising weight. Even the wind seemed to slow. Aiyana watched Caleb differently now. She had seen warriors prove courage with weapons. She had seen hunters prove strength by surviving winter. But this man measured bravery by restraint. That was far more difficult. The elder slowly nodded. Tomorrow, he said, we ride together. Several warriors looked surprised. Caleb looked even more surprised. I wasn't invited. A faint smile touched the elder's weathered face. You are now. As the morning sunlight spread across the valley, Aiyana found herself watching Caleb instead of the gathering warriors. Somewhere between the canyon where he had saved her life and this quiet moment beneath the open sky, the stranger she had sworn never to trust had become the one voice capable of calming two worlds before either chose violence. The following morning, riders from the Apache camp and the small ranching settlements gathered near the southern valley where weathered cottonwoods marked the edge of the disputed land. Dawn painted the prairie with soft gold, but no one admired the sunrise. Too many hands rested near rifles. Too many eyes searched for the smallest excuse to believe the worst about the people standing across from them. Caleb rode beside Aiyana without speaking. Neither tried to lead. They simply arrived together. That alone drew quiet whispers from both sides. Ahead, for well-dressed land speculators stood beside freshly driven survey stakes. Behind them waited a dozen hired guards. One of the men unfolded a map and smiled with the confidence of someone who believed paper carried more authority than truth. This valley belongs to the company now, he announced loudly. We've purchased every legal acre. The Apache elder accepted the map without haste. His weathered hands studied the markings before passing it to Caleb. Caleb examined the signatures carefully. Something immediately caught his attention. This isn't complete, he said. The spokesman laughed. You're a cowboy, not a lawyer. Caleb ignored the insult. He pointed to a missing seal near the bottom of the document. Without the county recorder's seal, this deed isn't valid. The smile slowly disappeared from the man's face. Several ranchers stepped closer to see for themselves. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The company representative folded the paper quickly. That's a technicality. No, Caleb answered calmly. That's the law. Frustration flashed across the man's face. He looked toward his hired guards, silently hoping intimidation would finish what paperwork could not. One guard shifted his rifle forward. At the same moment, several Apache warriors tightened their grip on their bows. The valley held its breath. Aiyana watched both sides carefully. One careless movement would send fear racing faster than reason. She stepped forward before anyone else could. Standing between the two groups, she lowered her own bow until its tip rested against the ground. The simple gesture echoed louder than any shouted command. Caleb understood immediately. Without taking his eyes off the armed men, he slowly removed his revolver from its holster. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Instead of aiming it, he laid the weapon on a nearby tree stump and stepped away. Nobody needs this today, he said quietly. For several endless seconds, no one moved. Then something unexpected happened. One elderly rancher removed his rifle and leaned it against his wagon. Another followed. Across the valley, an Apache warrior lowered his bow completely. Then another. The tension that had seemed impossible to break began dissolving one silent choice at a time. The company spokesman glanced around in disbelief. His hired guards no longer looked eager to fight men who refused to give them a battle. The elder finally spoke. You came expecting blood. His steady voice carried across the open valley. Instead, you found witnesses. Caleb handed the incomplete deed back to its owner. Return when you have the law behind you, he said. Until then, these stakes don't belong here. No one cheered as the speculators ordered their men to pull the survey markers from the ground. Victory arrived without celebration. It simply settled over the valley like the first cool breeze after a season of relentless heat. As wagons turned away and the last rider disappeared beyond the hills, Aiyana looked toward Caleb. For the first time since the canyon where their paths had crossed, she realized she no longer saw a white cowboy standing beside her. She saw a man whose courage had made two worlds lower their weapons before either had lost another soul. Years passed as quietly as seasons crossing the prairie. The valley where anger had almost claimed another generation slowly became a place where wagon tracks and horse trails crossed without fear. Cottonwood trees grew taller beside the creek, their branches casting shade over children who no longer cared which stories belonged to settlers and which belonged to the Apache. They simply chased one another through the grass until the evening wind called them home. Caleb Walker never became the richest rancher in the territory. He never served as sheriff or judge. His name rarely appeared in newspapers carried west from distant cities. Yet whenever a broken fence needed mending, a frightened traveler required shelter, or two neighbors found themselves one harsh word away from becoming enemies, someone inevitably said the same quiet sentence. "Go ask Caleb." He never refused. Aiyana remained as strong as the people had always remembered her, but strength had changed its meaning. Once it had meant standing alone. Now it meant knowing when another heart deserved to stand beside yours. She still rode into the mesas before sunrise, still hunted beneath endless skies, but she always returned before dusk to the little ranch where one weathered porch overlooked the valley that had changed both their lives. One autumn evening, the Apache elder arrived carrying a small bundle wrapped in worn buckskin. His hair had turned completely white, and time had carved deep lines across his face, but his eyes remained steady. Without ceremony, he placed the bundle into Aiyana's hands. Inside rested a single eagle feather bound with blue beads. "Our people give this only once," the elder said softly. "Not for the greatest hunter, not for the strongest warrior." He looked toward Caleb repairing a gate nearby. "For the one who teaches others that courage begins after pride ends." Caleb removed his hat, uncertain what to say. The elder smiled faintly. "Then say nothing." So he didn't. Some gifts were too honest for words. As the elder rode away beneath the fading sunset, Aiyana walked toward Caleb. The evening breeze stirred the tall prairie grass around them, while the first stars quietly awakened overhead. She held the feather for a long moment before placing it gently into his hand. Caleb looked at it, then at her. "This belongs to your people." Aiyana slowly shook her head. "Today, it belongs to ours." For the first time since the canyon where fate had thrown their paths together, she reached for his hand without hesitation. There was no audience waiting to applaud. No ceremony. No preacher. Only the whisper of cottonwood leaves, the scent of sage carried on the wind, and two souls who no longer measured one another by the color of their skin or the history carried by their ancestors. Caleb's fingers closed gently around hers. Aiyana smiled, the quiet smile that had once been reserved only for mountains and open skies. "Yes," she whispered. It was the first time any man had ever heard that word from her lips. Years later, children would ask why an eagle feather hung above the doorway of the old ranch house, beside an Apache bow and a weathered cowboy hat. Their parents never answered with tales of battles or revenge. They told a simpler story instead. A proud Apache woman once refused every man who sought her heart. A quiet cowboy asked for nothing at all. He offered only kindness when kindness carried the greatest risk. In the end, it was never strength that changed the frontier. It was compassion practiced often enough that fear finally grew tired of following it. And long after both riders had become part of the prairie they loved, the wind still crossed that valley carrying the same silent lesson. The bravest people are rarely remembered for the enemies they defeated, but for the strangers they chose to understand.